A charged confrontation erupts when a police officer, driven by prejudice, openly disrespects a black female judge, questioning her authority in a public courtroom. But with unshakable poise and sharp resolve, the judge turns the moment into a powerful display of justice, leading to a verdict that shocks everyone. This isn't just about one person, it's a story of resilience, integrity, and the fight against systemic bias. Experience the moment that changed everything, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of justice and equality. Grace Johnson moved swiftly through the courthouse parking lot, her sharp black blazer billowing slightly with each determined step. Her mind was already racing, a high-profile case awaited her, one that could set a precedent for the entire community. But as she approached the entrance, a sharp, mocking laugh from the lobby cut through her focus. Inside, Thomas Muir stood near the metal detector, his arms crossed and his expression smug. He whispered something to a colleague, his gaze fixed on Grace as she entered. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Grace's presence demanded attention, yet Thomas's demeanor made it clear he saw her authority as something to challenge. Stepping forward deliberately, Thomas positioned himself to block her path. His posture exuded an air of control, and his expression carried an unspoken disdain. Grace's pulse quickened, though not from fear. She recognized the calculated arrogance in his stance and braced herself for what she knew was coming. Grace placed her bag and ID on the inspection table with sharp, precise movements. Thomas lingered as he inspected the ID, flipping it over unnecessarily. His actions were deliberate, meant to undermine and provoke. The unease among the nearby clerks and lawyers was palpable, some averted their eyes while others cast furtive glances, hesitant to involve themselves. Thomas's mock scrutiny of the ID escalated as he made a point of questioning its legitimacy. The words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive, meant to sow doubt about her position. Grace remained calm outwardly, but her resolve hardened. She understood the game he was playing and refused to let him win. Grace leaned in slightly, her gaze steady and unflinching. Her presence alone carried the weight of her authority, and her silence conveyed more than words ever could. The tension in the room thickened as the seconds stretched. Those who had been pretending not to watch were now captivated, their discomfort evident. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas hesitated. His confidence faltered under the weight of Grace's unwavering composure. He tossed the ID back onto the table with exaggerated indifference, stepping aside begrudgingly. Grace collected her belongings without a word, her movements deliberate and dignified. As she walked through the metal detector and continued down the hallway, the lobby remained still. The moment lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, a silent acknowledgement of the power dynamics at play. For Grace, it was another hurdle in her day, but one she had cleared with her integrity intact. For Thomas, it was a seed of doubt, planted in a moment of confrontation that would stay with him longer than he anticipated. Grace Johnson's footsteps echoed down the courthouse hallway as she approached her chambers. Her mind was already shifting focus to the upcoming case, but the tension from her earlier encounter with Thomas Muir lingered in the back of her thoughts. She knew it wouldn't be the last time she'd face his animosity, but she resolved to keep her attention where it mattered most, delivering justice in the courtroom. Behind her, the courthouse buzzed with activity, yet in a corner of the lobby, Thomas Muir stood frozen, his composure unraveling. The brief exchange with Grace had unsettled him more than he'd admit. His usual bravado felt hollow, and the murmurs among his colleagues fed into his growing paranoia. Thomas clenched his fists, anger welling up inside him. He refused to let this incident define him. In the security office, Thomas's colleague, Officer David Kane, watched the scene unfold on the surveillance monitor. David had always kept his distance from Thomas, finding his attitude toxic, but today's confrontation sparked something new, curiosity. David replayed the footage, scrutinizing the tension in their interaction. He wondered if Thomas's behavior might finally lead to consequences. A small part of him hoped it would. Meanwhile, Grace sat at her desk, flipping through the files for the case at hand. Her phone buzzed with a text from a trusted colleague, reminding her of the high stakes involved. The case, involving a large real estate firm accused of illegal land seizure, had drawn significant public attention. Grace knew she was under a microscope, and every decision she made would carry weight beyond the courtroom. The pressure was immense, but she'd never let it show. Thomas couldn't shake his growing resentment. As he paced in the break room, he muttered to himself, replaying the encounter. His thoughts twisted the narrative, framing himself as the victim. He convinced himself that Grace had overstepped, and he began to consider ways to undermine her authority. A dangerous idea began to take shape, one that would escalate the conflict far beyond a simple security checkpoint. Elsewhere in the courthouse, Deputy Clerk Rachel Morales was processing documents when she overheard two clerks discussing the incident. The whispers carried a mix of awe for Grace's composure and apprehension about Thomas's reaction. Rachel, who had endured her own share of Thomas's hostility, felt a flicker of hope. Grace's unwavering stance had ignited something in her. For the first time, Rachel considered speaking out about the pattern of abuse she'd witnessed. Back in his office, Thomas began rifling through paperwork, searching for procedural loopholes he could exploit. His mind raced with schemes to humiliate Grace or at least make her job more difficult. He justified his actions as a means of maintaining order, yet deep down, a gnawing doubt began to creep in. He buried it quickly, unwilling to confront the possibility that he might be in the wrong. David Kane watched Thomas from a distance, noticing his agitated movements and muttered curses. David debated whether to intervene or report his behavior but hesitated. Years of working in the courthouse had taught him that challenging someone like Thomas often came with repercussions. Still, David couldn't ignore the unease growing in his gut. As the hours passed, Grace entered the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate respect. The gallery was packed, tension thick in the air as the trial began. The plaintiffs, a group of displaced residents, sat nervously in the back rows, their faces etched with worry. Across the aisle, the legal team for the real estate firm exuded confidence, their every move calculated. Grace maintained her focus, her voice steady as she addressed the court. Outside the courtroom, Thomas lingered near the entrance, listening intently to the proceedings. He told himself it was part of his job to monitor the situation, but the truth was, he couldn't stay away. His resentment toward Grace had become an obsession, and he needed to feel some measure of control over the unfolding events. Rachel, passing by with a stack of documents, noticed Thomas's tense posture and paused. She debated whether to confront him, to ask why he was so fixated on undermining Grace. But fear held her back, and she moved on, her resolve wavering. Yet the seed of courage planted by Grace's earlier stand remained, quietly growing. Inside the courtroom, Grace listened intently as the plaintiff's lawyer presented their case. The stories of displacement and exploitation were harrowing, and she felt the weight of their trust in her. The defense's arguments were sharp and calculated, aimed at undermining the plaintiff's credibility. Grace's sharp mind picked apart every point, ensuring that nothing escaped her scrutiny. Back in the security office, David Kane finally made a decision. He pulled up past reports and records involving Thomas, compiling a dossier of complaints and questionable behavior. It was a risky move, but he couldn't stand idly by any longer. David's conscience wouldn't allow it. Thomas, unaware of David's actions, continued to stew in his bitterness. He intercepted Rachel in the hallway, making a snide remark about her workload. Rachel froze, her usual response one of compliance, but today something shifted. She met his gaze, her voice steady as she replied that she was simply doing her job. The exchange was brief, but it left Thomas rattled. He could feel the control slipping from his grasp. The trial continued, with Grace expertly navigating the complexities of the case. The real estate firm's lawyers attempted to overwhelm the court with technical jargon, but Grace's incisive questions cut through their facade. Each time she spoke, the room fell silent, the gravity of her words commanding attention. The plaintiff's lawyer, emboldened by her presence, pushed harder, presenting evidence that painted a damning picture of the corporation's actions. As the day drew to a close, Grace returned to her chambers, exhausted but resolute. She reviewed her notes, preparing for the next day's proceedings. A knock at her door interrupted her focus. Rachel entered hesitantly, her expression conflicted. She admitted that she'd overheard Thomas making disparaging comments and hinted at a broader pattern of behavior. Grace listened carefully, her heart sinking as the pieces began to fit together. She assured Rachel that her concerns would be taken seriously and thanked her for coming forward. Rachel left, a mix of relief and apprehension in her steps, but Grace's resolve only deepened. She knew the battle extended beyond the courtroom. Meanwhile, Thomas received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end claimed to have information that could help him put Grace in her place. Tempted by the offer, Thomas agreed to meet. The conversation left him feeling emboldened, but the gnawing doubt he'd suppressed earlier began to resurface, clawing at the edges of his thoughts. David Kane finalized his report, placing it in an envelope marked "Confidential." He hesitated for a moment before sliding it into the internal mail slot addressed to the head of security. It was a gamble, but David felt a surge of relief. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful. As the courthouse emptied for the day, the tension remained, simmering beneath the surface. Grace sat alone in her chambers, staring at the stacks of files on her desk. She thought about the plaintiffs, the displaced families counting on her, and the toxic dynamics within the courthouse walls. The weight was immense, but she squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. Thomas, on the other hand, drove home in silence, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The phone call lingered, a sinister promise of retribution that both excited and unsettled him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him was shifting, and for the first time, he wasn't sure where he stood. Rachel walked to her car, the cool evening air helping to calm her nerves. She replayed her conversation with Grace, feeling a flicker of pride that she had spoken up. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And in the shadows of the courthouse, unseen by most, the seeds of conflict continued to grow, setting the stage for a confrontation that none of them could fully anticipate. The morning tension in the courthouse was palpable. Grace Johnson arrived earlier than usual, her mind already anticipating the continuation of the high-profile trial. Before she could settle into her chambers, a court officer handed her a sealed envelope marked "Urgent." The note inside was anonymous, warning her to tread carefully with the case. The timing and anonymity of the note unsettled her, but she slipped it into a folder and focused on the day ahead. Thomas Muir arrived shortly after, his mood dark and restless. The confrontation with Grace the day before lingered in his thoughts, fueling a deep agitation. He snapped at a junior officer without provocation, barely masking the unease growing within him. The anonymous call he had received the night before replayed in his mind, offering a promise of a way to undermine Grace. The temptation gnawed at him, even as a flicker of doubt tried to surface. Rachel Morales spent her morning in the records room, her hands shaky as she sorted through files. The courage she had summoned to speak to Grace was beginning to falter. Doubts crept in. What if nothing changed? What if Thomas retaliated? She replayed Grace's reassurances in her mind, trying to steady herself and remember why she had spoken up. David Kane spent the early hours scanning the internal system for any updates on the envelope he had submitted to the head of security. It had vanished from the mail slot, but no acknowledgement or follow-up had come. He wondered if his report on Thomas's behavior had been ignored or if something more covert was happening. His frustration grew, but he resolved to wait a little longer before deciding his next steps. Inside the courtroom, the trial resumed with mounting intensity. The plaintiff's lawyer called their first witness, a displaced resident whose testimony painted a harrowing picture of hardship. Grace listened intently, absorbing every detail with a calm but commanding presence. The defense, sharp and calculated, sought to discredit the witness with aggressive cross-examination. Grace's firm interjections shifted the balance, her authority reshaping the dynamics in the room. In the hallway, Thomas lingered near the courtroom entrance under the guise of patrol duty. His fixation on Grace had deepened into an obsession, drawing him to the trial's progress. The anonymous caller's words replayed in his mind, offering what he saw as a lifeline to regain control. During a break, Grace returned to her chambers only to find another note waiting on her desk. This one was more direct, warning her to drop the case or face the consequences. Her hands trembled momentarily before she steadied herself. She reported the note to security, ensuring it was logged as evidence, but her mind raced with questions about the source of the threats. Rachel's determination wavered until she overheard colleagues discussing Grace's commanding presence in the courtroom. Their admiration reminded her why she had spoken out. She decided to document every instance of Thomas's behavior that she could remember, creating a record she could use if needed. David's day took an unexpected turn when he was called into a meeting with the head of security. The man held David's envelope in his hand, his expression unreadable. To David's surprise, the head of security acknowledged the validity of the concerns raised. An internal investigation into Thomas's behavior was approved, but David was cautioned to proceed carefully. Change, he was warned, would not come without resistance. Back in the courtroom, the defense's witness, a corporate representative, delivered polished answers designed to deflect accountability. For a moment, the momentum seemed to shift in favor of the corporation. However, Grace's incisive questions during cross-examination began to unravel their narrative, exposing inconsistencies that sent ripples through the gallery. Thomas's frustration deepened as he observed Grace's control over the proceedings. Feeling powerless, he decided to act. He stepped outside during lunch and dialed the number provided by the anonymous caller. The instructions he received were clear: a meeting place, a time, and a promise of information that could discredit Grace. Despite lingering doubts, Thomas agreed, driven by his anger. As the day wore on, Grace remained focused on the trial but couldn't shake the shadow of the threats against her. She shared her concerns with a trusted colleague, who urged her to stay vigilant. The exchange only deepened Grace's resolve to see the trial through. That evening, after the courthouse emptied, Thomas drove to the meeting place specified by the anonymous caller. The dimly lit parking garage heightened his tension. A man emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a hood, and handed Thomas a folder. The contents promised to damage Grace's reputation. Thomas hesitated briefly, doubt flickering in his mind, but he took the folder and left in silence. At home, Grace reviewed her notes, reflecting on the day's key moments in the courtroom. Pride in the plaintiff's progress was tempered by the growing threats against her. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily, but she resolved to remain steadfast. Rachel, in her small apartment, typed out her account of Thomas's behavior, pouring every detail into her document. It was a small step, but it felt like progress toward reclaiming her voice and courage. David worked late, compiling additional evidence to support the investigation. He felt a renewed sense of purpose but knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Thomas was entrenched, and exposing his behavior would come at a cost. Thomas sat alone in his car, staring at the folder in his lap. The contents felt heavier than paper, a representation of the moral line he was about to cross. He opened the folder and scanned its contents, finding damning information that could destroy Grace's credibility. Yet something about it felt wrong. Doubt gnawed at him, but he suppressed it, convincing himself that this was the only way to reclaim his power. The pieces were in motion, each character propelled toward a confrontation none of them could fully foresee. The tension was no longer simmering, it was on the brink of boiling over, setting the stage for the next explosive chapter. The courthouse was already humming with anticipation by the time Grace Johnson arrived. Her focus remained razor-sharp as she walked toward the courtroom, aware that the day ahead would bring pivotal moments. The weight of the trial, combined with the mounting threats, loomed large in her mind, but she channeled that pressure into a steely determination. She couldn't afford to falter. Inside the courtroom, the gallery filled quickly with spectators and journalists eager to witness the drama unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of excitement and unease. The plaintiff's seats were occupied by the displaced residents, their faces a blend of hope and apprehension. Across the aisle, the legal team for the real estate firm appeared confident, their expressions calculated and self-assured. Grace took her seat at the bench, her presence commanding immediate attention. Thomas Muir's day had started with a gnawing sense of purpose. The folder handed to him the night before sat in his bag, its contents waiting to be unleashed. He had spent hours poring over the material, his initial doubts giving way to a growing resolve. The information could ruin Grace, and while a small part of him hesitated, his anger and resentment drowned out any lingering guilt. He arrived at the courthouse with a plan, his movements deliberate as he made his way to the security office. David Kane observed Thomas from a distance, noting his rigid posture and the grim set of his jaw. Something about Thomas's demeanor felt off, even more so than usual. David's instincts told him to stay alert, and he resolved to keep a closer eye on his colleague throughout the day. The investigation into Thomas's behavior was underway, but David sensed that things were about to escalate. Rachel Morales spent the morning bracing herself for what she suspected would be another difficult day. Her decision to document Thomas's actions had given her a sense of empowerment, but fear lingered in the back of her mind. She wondered if her efforts would ever make a difference or if the toxic environment would continue unchecked. Still, the memory of Grace's composure inspired her to push forward, one small step at a time. The trial resumed with a flurry of activity. The plaintiff's lawyer introduced new evidence, a series of documents that exposed discrepancies in the real estate firm's records. The defense team immediately objected, their voices rising in protest. Grace maintained control of the courtroom, her ruling swift and decisive as she allowed the evidence to be admitted. The tension between the two legal teams crackled like static electricity. Thomas lingered near the courtroom entrance, listening intently to the proceedings. The folder in his bag felt heavier with each passing moment. He had planned to anonymously leak the information about Grace during a recess, ensuring maximum impact. The thought sent a thrill through him, but it was accompanied by a growing unease he couldn't quite shake. As the morning wore on, David noticed Thomas's repeated trips to the hallway outside the courtroom. His behavior was unusually erratic, and David decided to follow him discreetly. He trailed Thomas to a secluded corner of the courthouse, where he saw him pull out the folder and stare at its contents. David's heart sank as he realized what Thomas might be planning. Without confronting him directly, David made a mental note to alert the head of security immediately. Inside the courtroom, the defense team attempted to regain control, calling a surprise witness to testify. The move caught the plaintiff's lawyer off guard, but Grace's sharp questioning quickly leveled the playing field. The witness's testimony wavered under her scrutiny, and cracks began to form in the defense's strategy. The gallery watched in stunned silence, their attention riveted on Grace as she methodically dismantled the witness's credibility. During the lunch break, Rachel crossed paths with Thomas in the hallway. She felt a chill as he passed her, his expression unreadable but his eyes cold and focused. Rachel's instincts told her that something was wrong, and she debated whether to mention her concerns to David. Ultimately, she decided to trust her gut and made her way to the security office, where she found David reviewing surveillance footage. David listened intently as Rachel described her encounter with Thomas. Her observations confirmed his suspicions, and the two agreed to keep a close watch on him for the remainder of the day. David shared his concerns about the folder he had seen, and Rachel's unease deepened. They both knew they were walking a fine line, but neither was willing to stand by and let Thomas's actions go unchecked. Grace spent the lunch break in her chambers, reviewing the new evidence presented that morning. The threats against her lingered in her thoughts, but she refused to let them distract her from the task at hand. She reminded herself of the stakes, not just for the plaintiffs but for the integrity of the court. Her determination solidified as she prepared for the afternoon session. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself grappling with an unexpected wave of doubt. The folder in his bag had seemed like a weapon of control, but now it felt like a ticking time bomb. He thought about the consequences of his actions, the potential fallout if his involvement were discovered. Yet his resentment toward Grace burned hotter, pushing him closer to the edge. The afternoon session began with a dramatic turn. The plaintiff's lawyer called an expert witness whose testimony provided a clear link between the real estate firm's actions and the resident's displacement. The defense team's objections grew more desperate, their confidence unraveling under the weight of the evidence. Grace maintained order, her rulings cutting through the chaos and keeping the trial on track. Thomas's resolve finally cracked when he received a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Act now, or the opportunity will slip away." His heart raced as he realized the sender was likely the same anonymous source who had given him the folder. The pressure mounted, and he knew he had to make a decision. He stepped out of the courtroom and made his way to the security office, where he planned to leave the folder where it would be discovered. David saw Thomas enter the office and quickly followed. He watched as Thomas placed the folder on a desk and walked away, his movements hurried and tense. David approached the desk cautiously, opening the folder to reveal its contents. His stomach churned as he scanned the documents, realizing the extent of the damage they could cause. He knew he had to act quickly to prevent the information from being weaponized. As the trial continued, Grace's cross-examination of the defense's expert witness left the courtroom in stunned silence. Her questions were precise, her tone unwavering, and the witness's credibility crumbled under the pressure. The plaintiff's case gained significant ground, and the gallery buzzed with anticipation. The trial was reaching a tipping point, and everyone could feel it. David took the folder directly to the head of security, explaining the situation in urgent detail. The head of security agreed to secure the documents and launch an immediate inquiry into their origin. David's actions set off a chain reaction, as the courthouse staff began to piece together the events leading up to the folder's appearance. Thomas returned to his post, unaware that his plan was already unraveling. He felt a fleeting sense of relief, believing he had finally regained control. But that relief was short-lived when he noticed David and the head of security conferring in hushed tones. Panic set in as he realized his actions were being scrutinized. The day ended with the trial's momentum firmly in the plaintiff's favor. Grace left the courtroom feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. The threats against her still loomed, but she drew strength from the progress made in the case. She reminded herself that the fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. Rachel and David met in the hallway, their expressions reflecting both relief and resolve. They knew the day's events had been a turning point, but they also understood that the battle was far from over. They agreed to remain vigilant, determined to protect the integrity of the courthouse and support Grace in her pursuit of justice. Thomas sat alone in his car, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. His plan had failed, and the consequences were beginning to close in. For the first time, he felt the full extent of his isolation, the choices he had made leaving him with no one to turn to. The folder that had seemed like his ticket to victory now felt like an anchor dragging him down. As the courthouse lights dimmed and the halls grew quiet, the stage was set for the next act in the unfolding drama. The lines between right and wrong blurred further, and the stakes continued to rise. Each character moved closer to a reckoning, their choices propelling them toward a confrontation that would leave no one untouched. Grace Johnson walked into the courthouse the next morning, her mind already racing. The trial was entering a critical phase, and every detail mattered. The stakes had grown higher with each passing day, but the threats against her added a new layer of tension. She resolved to remain steadfast, knowing that the residents relying on her deserved nothing less. Thomas Muir arrived shortly after, his unease growing by the minute. The events of the previous day haunted him, and the sight of David Kane speaking with the head of security had only confirmed his fears. His attempt to discredit Grace had backfired, and now he felt the walls closing in. He avoided eye contact with his colleagues, his usual bravado replaced with a simmering paranoia. David spent the morning briefing the head of security on the folder's contents and their implications. The documents were now under lock and key, but the questions they raised were troubling. David's instincts told him that Thomas had acted on someone else's instructions, but proving that connection would require patience and vigilance. For now, his priority was ensuring Grace's safety and preserving the integrity of the trial. Rachel Morales watched the courthouse activity with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. She had overheard whispers about the folder and suspected Thomas's involvement, though she had no concrete evidence. The courage she had drawn from Grace's example continued to grow, and she resolved to keep documenting her experiences. She knew the time would come when her voice would be needed. Inside the courtroom, the trial resumed with the defense presenting a last-minute motion to suppress key evidence. The move was calculated to stall the proceedings and shift momentum in their favor. Grace reviewed the motion carefully, her focus unshaken by the courtroom's rising tension. Her ruling was decisive, allowing the evidence to stand and sending a clear message that tactics of delay would not be tolerated. The defense's legal team scrambled to adjust, their confidence shaken. Meanwhile, the plaintiff's lawyer seized the opportunity to strengthen their case, calling a new witness whose testimony painted an even clearer picture of the real estate firm's unethical practices. Grace listened intently, her sharp mind piecing together the puzzle as the trial unfolded. Thomas lingered near the courtroom's entrance, his presence a shadow over the proceedings. He felt the weight of his actions more acutely now, but his resentment toward Grace burned just as fiercely. The anonymous source who had provided the folder had gone silent, leaving Thomas to grapple with the fallout alone. He began to wonder if he had been set up, but the thought only deepened his frustration. David noticed Thomas's behavior and kept a close watch, discreetly coordinating with the head of security to monitor his movements. The investigation into Thomas's actions was gaining traction, and David was determined to see it through. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes were higher than they appeared, and every step needed to be calculated carefully. Rachel's resolve was tested when she crossed paths with Thomas in the hallway. His expression was unreadable, but the tension between them was unmistakable. She resisted the urge to confront him, instead focusing on her plan to share her documentation with David when the time was right. She knew that confronting Thomas directly could backfire, but her patience was wearing thin. As the trial continued, Grace's commanding presence in the courtroom became even more apparent. Her incisive questions and unwavering focus left no room for evasion, and the defense's strategy began to unravel. The gallery's attention was fixed on her, their respect for her growing with each passing moment. Outside the courtroom, Thomas received another anonymous message. The text was cryptic, hinting at a new opportunity to disrupt the trial. His hands trembled as he read the message, torn between the desire to act and the fear of further consequences. He felt like a pawn in someone else's game, but his anger blinded him to the bigger picture. David intercepted Thomas as he was leaving the courthouse during a recess, his tone calm but firm. He asked Thomas about his involvement with the folder, framing the question as a chance for him to come clean. Thomas deflected, his voice defensive and strained. The encounter left both men on edge, their mutual distrust deepening. Rachel, sensing that tensions were reaching a boiling point, decided it was time to share her documentation. She approached David in the break room, her hands shaking as she handed over a folder containing detailed accounts of Thomas's behavior. David thanked her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. He promised to use the information responsibly and assured her that her courage would not go unnoticed. Grace's chambers became a hub of activity as she prepared for the afternoon session. Her trusted clerk briefed her on the defense's latest moves, and she reviewed the key points with meticulous care. The threats against her remained an undercurrent, but she refused to let them distract her from the task at hand. The afternoon session brought a series of dramatic revelations. The plaintiff's lawyer presented a piece of evidence that had been overlooked earlier in the trial, a document linking the real estate firm's executives to the displacement of residents. The courtroom erupted with murmurs, the defense scrambling to contain the damage. Grace's gavel brought order, her voice cutting through the noise with authority. Thomas watched the chaos unfold from the hallway, his mind racing. The anonymous messages, the folder, and the mounting pressure were taking a toll on him. He felt like a fuse about to ignite, unsure of where the explosion would lead. The fear of being exposed clashed with his desire to strike back, leaving him paralyzed. David's day took another turn when the head of security called him into a meeting to discuss the ongoing investigation. They reviewed Rachel's documentation alongside the evidence from the folder, building a case that pointed to a coordinated effort to undermine Grace and the trial. The pieces were falling into place, but the full picture remained elusive. Rachel spent the rest of the day quietly observing the courthouse dynamics, her confidence bolstered by her decision to share her story. She noticed small shifts in the atmosphere, subtle signs that her actions were making an impact. The realization gave her a sense of purpose, even as the tension around her continued to mount. As the session concluded, Grace delivered a ruling that further solidified the plaintiff's position. The defense team left the courtroom visibly shaken, their confidence eroded by the day's events. Grace remained composed, but the exhaustion was evident in her eyes as she returned to her chambers. Thomas's frustration reached a breaking point as he sat alone in the security office, staring at his phone. The anonymous messages had stopped, leaving him to grapple with the consequences of his actions. He felt abandoned, his anger giving way to a creeping sense of despair. The realization that he had been manipulated hit him like a cold wave, but he didn't know how to undo the damage. David and Rachel met in the hallway after the courthouse had emptied, their conversation marked by a shared sense of determination. They discussed the day's developments and the next steps in the investigation, their resolve strengthening with each word. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they were committed to seeing it through. Grace stayed late in her chambers, reviewing the trial's progress and preparing for the next day. She reflected on the challenges she had faced and the strength she had drawn from those around her. The threats against her remained a shadow, but she refused to let them define her journey. As the courthouse lights dimmed, each character was left alone with their thoughts. The tension had reached a new peak, and the choices they faced would shape the events to come. The battle for justice was far from over, and the lines between right and wrong continued to blur. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave no one unchanged. The tension in the courthouse was almost unbearable as the trial neared its climax. Grace Johnson arrived early, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The progress made in the case had been substantial, but the threats, the manipulation, and the undercurrents of deceit had reached an all-time high. She reminded herself that justice demanded persistence, even when the stakes felt insurmountable. Thomas Muir's morning was consumed by paranoia. He hadn't slept well, haunted by the fallout of his failed attempt to sabotage Grace. The head of security's growing scrutiny and David Kane's persistent watchfulness made it clear that his actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Every interaction felt like a threat, every glance like an accusation. His nerves were fraying, and he was running out of options. David spent the early hours preparing for a meeting with the head of security and other key personnel. The evidence they had gathered painted a damning picture, but there were still gaps to fill. David's instincts told him that the anonymous source who had fed Thomas the folder was part of a larger scheme. Unraveling that connection would be critical, but time was running out. Rachel Morales arrived at the courthouse with a newfound resolve. Sharing her documentation with David had been a turning point, and she felt a sense of relief knowing her experiences were now part of the investigation. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas might retaliate. She stayed vigilant, her courage tempered by caution. Inside the courtroom, the trial resumed with a palpable sense of urgency. The plaintiff's lawyer called their final witness, a whistleblower from within the real estate firm. Their testimony was explosive, revealing internal communications that proved the executives had knowingly orchestrated the displacement of residents. The gallery erupted in murmurs, and the defense scrambled to discredit the witness. Grace maintained order with her usual authority, her focus unshaken despite the dramatic turn of events. Her questions to the witness were sharp and precise, cutting through the noise to extract the truth. The defense's objections grew increasingly desperate, but Grace's rulings kept the trial on track. The tension in the room was electric, every word and gesture carrying immense weight. Thomas lingered outside the courtroom, unable to tear himself away from the unfolding drama. His mind raced as he considered his dwindling options. The anonymous messages had stopped entirely, leaving him to navigate the fallout alone. He felt like a pawn abandoned by its master, his anger at Grace now mingled with a deep sense of betrayal. David watched Thomas closely, noting his erratic behavior. He had spent the morning piecing together the timeline of events, and the picture that emerged pointed to a deliberate effort to undermine Grace. David's determination to expose the truth only grew stronger, but he knew the final pieces of the puzzle would be the hardest to obtain. Rachel's day took a tense turn when she found a cryptic note in her desk. The message warned her to stay out of matters that don't concern you. Her heart raced as she considered the implications. The note was unsigned, but its intent was clear. She debated whether to report it, ultimately deciding to share it with David. She refused to be intimidated, but the threat added a new layer of fear to her day. The trial's afternoon session was marked by a critical turning point. The plaintiff's lawyer presented a damning piece of evidence, a signed memo from the real estate firm's CEO acknowledging the unethical practices and instructing employees to cover their tracks. The defense's attempts to dismiss the memo were weak, and the courtroom buzzed with the realization that the case was slipping away from them. Grace's composure never wavered as she addressed the court, outlining the relevance of the evidence with clarity and conviction. Her words carried a weight that silenced the gallery, reminding everyone of the gravity of the proceedings. The defense team looked visibly shaken, their confidence eroded by the day's developments. Thomas's frustration reached a breaking point as he paced in the hallway. The pressure was unbearable, and he felt like a ticking time bomb. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old messages from the anonymous source. Desperation clouded his judgment as he contemplated his next move, his thoughts spiraling into darker territory. David and Rachel met during a brief recess, their conversation hushed but urgent. Rachel showed him the note she had received, and David's expression hardened. They agreed to report it to the head of security immediately, recognizing it as another piece of the puzzle. David's suspicions about a coordinated effort to sabotage Grace deepened, and he resolved to dig even deeper. Grace returned to her chambers during the recess, taking a moment to reflect on the day's progress. The weight of the trial and the threats against her were immense, but she drew strength from the knowledge that justice was within reach. Her clerk interrupted her thoughts with an update on the defense's next move, a request to call a surprise witness. Grace's instincts told her this was a last-ditch effort to regain control, and she prepared herself accordingly. The defense's surprise witness was a former employee of the real estate firm who claimed to have evidence exonerating the executives. Their testimony was rehearsed and polished, but Grace's incisive questioning quickly revealed inconsistencies. The gallery watched in stunned silence as Grace dismantled the witnesses' credibility, her sharp mind cutting through their facade. Outside the courtroom, Thomas made a fateful decision. He contacted the anonymous source one last time, demanding answers. To his surprise, the call was answered, and the voice on the other end offered a cryptic promise of a final opportunity to strike back. The instructions were vague but urgent, and Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline as he prepared to act. David, sensing that Thomas was on the verge of doing something reckless, coordinated with the head of security to monitor his movements. The investigation had uncovered enough evidence to justify heightened surveillance, and David was determined to prevent any further damage. He shared his concerns with Rachel, who offered to help in any way she could. The trial's final moments approached, the tension in the courtroom reaching its peak. The plaintiff's lawyer delivered a powerful closing argument, weaving together the evidence and testimony into a compelling narrative. Grace listened intently, her expression unreadable but her presence commanding. The defense's closing argument was a stark contrast, marked by desperation and thinly veiled attempts to distract from the facts. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Grace addressed the court one last time, her words a reminder of the responsibility they all shared in seeking the truth. The gallery erupted in murmurs as the session adjourned, the weight of the case settling over everyone in the room. Thomas's day ended in chaos. His attempt to follow the anonymous source's instructions had led him into a trap, exposing his actions to the head of security in David. Confronted with irrefutable evidence of his involvement, Thomas broke down, his anger giving way to despair. The fallout was swift, and his career lay in ruins. David and Rachel stood together as the day's events unfolded, their shared determination vindicated. The investigation had uncovered not only Thomas's actions but also the larger scheme behind the attempts to sabotage Grace. They knew there was still work to be done, but the tide had turned in their favor. Grace left the courthouse that evening with a sense of hard-earned accomplishment. The jury's deliberation would determine the case's outcome, but she felt confident that justice was within reach. The threats and challenges had tested her resolve, but she had emerged stronger, a beacon of integrity in the face of adversity. As the courthouse grew quiet and the lights dimmed, each character reflected on the day's events. The lines between right and wrong had been tested, but the pursuit of justice had prevailed. The stage was set for the final chapter, where the consequences of their choices would be fully realized. The morning of the verdict brought an uneasy calm to the courthouse. Grace Johnson sat in her chambers, her thoughts a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The case had tested every ounce of her strength, but she had remained steadfast, knowing the integrity of the court depended on her unwavering commitment. The threats, the sabotage attempts, and the intense scrutiny had forged her into a stronger version of herself. Today, justice would prevail, or so she hoped. Thomas Muir's world had crumbled. After his exposure, he had been suspended pending an official review. The weight of his decisions bore down on him, and the realization of how he had been used left him hollow. He spent the morning alone, replaying the events that had led to his downfall. Anger at himself mingled with a flicker of relief that the truth had finally come to light. Yet he couldn't escape the thought that his actions had set events in motion that could not be undone. David Kane stood outside the courtroom, his expression tense but determined. The investigation had uncovered a web of deceit that stretched further than he had anticipated. Coordinated efforts to undermine Grace and disrupt the trial had been traced back to individuals with vested interests in the real estate firm's success. The revelations had shocked even the most seasoned courthouse staff. David felt vindicated but knew there was still work to be done. Rachel Morales arrived with a renewed sense of purpose. Her decision to document and report Thomas's behavior had been instrumental in exposing the truth. She felt a quiet pride in knowing her courage had contributed to a larger cause. The cryptic threats she had received no longer held power over her. Instead, she walked into the courthouse with her head high, ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom filled quickly, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. The plaintiffs sat together, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. Across the aisle, the defense team appeared subdued, their confidence shaken by the trial's final developments. Grace entered the courtroom with her usual composure, her presence commanding immediate respect. As she took her seat, the gallery fell silent. The jury entered, their expressions unreadable. Grace's heart quickened, but she maintained her calm exterior. The foreperson stood, delivering the verdict in a steady voice. The plaintiffs had won. The real estate firm was found guilty of all charges, and the displaced residents were awarded significant damages. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs, the weight of the decision washing over everyone present. Grace struck her gavel, bringing the room back to order. She addressed the court with a measured tone, emphasizing the importance of accountability and the rule of law. Her words resonated deeply, leaving no doubt about the significance of the case. The plaintiffs wept with relief, their gratitude palpable. For them, this was more than a legal victory, it was a validation of their struggles and a chance to rebuild their lives. Thomas watched the proceedings from a distance, his emotions a storm of regret and introspection. The verdict underscored the gravity of his actions, and he couldn't help but wonder how things might have been different if he had chosen another path. The anonymous source who had manipulated him remained a shadowy figure, their motives unclear. Thomas resolved to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, hoping to salvage some semblance of redemption. David and Rachel stood together, their expressions reflecting a mixture of triumph and determination. The victory in the courtroom was significant, but they knew the battle against corruption and abuse of power was far from over. They had both found a renewed sense of purpose in their roles, their actions proving that change was possible even in the face of systemic challenges. Grace returned to her chambers after the verdict, the weight of the trial finally lifting. Her clerk entered with a stack of documents, congratulating her on the outcome. Grace offered a rare smile, her gratitude evident. She reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, the obstacles she had overcome, and the resilience she had discovered within herself. The aftermath of the trial rippled through the courthouse and beyond. The investigation into the real estate firm's practices led to further legal actions, exposing a network of unethical dealings. The individuals involved faced accountability, their influence diminished. The courthouse staff, inspired by the trial's outcome, began pushing for reforms to prevent future abuses of power. Thomas met with David and the head of security, offering his full cooperation. He disclosed everything he knew about the anonymous source and their attempts to manipulate the trial. The information he provided became a crucial piece of the puzzle, allowing the investigation to move forward. Though his actions had caused significant harm, his willingness to come clean marked the beginning of a difficult but necessary path toward redemption. Rachel's bravery did not go unnoticed. Her documentation of Thomas's behavior became a key part of the investigation, and her role in exposing the truth was recognized by her colleagues. She found herself stepping into a leadership role, using her experiences to advocate for a safer and more equitable workplace. The transformation she underwent during the trial became an inspiration to others. David continued his work with renewed vigor, determined to root out the systemic issues that had allowed the corruption to flourish. His collaboration with Grace and Rachel solidified a network of allies within the courthouse, individuals committed to upholding justice and integrity. The bonds they formed during the trial became a foundation for lasting change. As the courthouse settled back into its routine, the impact of the trial lingered. Grace's name became synonymous with resilience and fairness, her leadership a beacon for those who sought justice. The plaintiffs began rebuilding their lives, their victory in court providing them with the resources and validation they needed to move forward. Thomas faced a long road ahead, his reputation tarnished and his career in ruins. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. He resolved to take responsibility for his actions and find a way to contribute positively, even if it meant starting over. The weight of his choices would never fully leave him, but he hoped to use his experience as a lesson for others. The anonymous source who had orchestrated much of the sabotage remained elusive, but their influence had been significantly diminished. The investigation continued, uncovering new leads and exposing the depths of their network. While the fight was far from over, the trial had sent a clear message: justice would prevail, no matter the obstacles. Grace stood on the courthouse steps as the sun set, the golden light casting a warm glow over the building. She took a deep breath, her mind already turning to the challenges that lay ahead. The pursuit of justice was relentless, but so was her resolve. With each step forward, she carried the lessons of the trial and the strength of those who had stood with her. The fight was never over, but neither was the hope for a better future.